if you made it to part 3, I just want to say very quickly, you are a real one. All right, that's all I want to say. If you made it to part 3 and you've been keeping up with the series, you're a real one. Hopefully you tune in for the movie version of this as well, but I can't really expect a lot of you to do that who actually finished watching the entire series. That said though, guys, I do hope you guys go on to enjoy part 3, and with nothing else to say from me, enjoy.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
Alright, picking up where we left off the last part, Kirishima and Tokiyami had yelled, "No!" And eventually, she would get to the bomb. She grips it, and all you hear is All Might saying, "Hero Team wins!" As Kirishima and Tokiyami both just look like they look defeated. They both just accept that they just lost, and they look towards Izuku, who's at the moment just still in his fighting pose, who just barely ended up taking in the information. They look towards him and say that he's actually a great fighter, and they all dab each other up before then going over to the area where Momo proceeds to tell everybody that if there had to be an MVP, it was definitely Izuku Midoriya, saying that the villain team, while they did their best, they completely forgot to account for Uraraka just because she wasn't a fighter, and that inevitably costed them the match. This is when Kirishima and Tokiyami would walk into the room and they'd be like, "Yeah, basically that's what happened." As from here, what ends up going down is essentially everybody else has their matches. And after that happens, we essentially cut to Izuku going home, getting a text message from All Might messaging him to meet him on the beach yet again. Izuku would do so, and from here, All Might would question Izuku how far he's gotten over the past couple of days. And Izuku would say that he's definitely been training on his own, going to the gym and stuff like that without using his quirk, but he doesn't know how far he could possibly get just doing these normal training methods. With All Might explaining that pretty soon he's gonna go meet a certain somebody that he believes will help him progress leaps and bounds with his training. Izuku would be extremely excited at this, before All Might would say, "But Midoriya, I believe it's time for our daily spar." For All Might buffs up, and Izuku would say, "Oh yeah, now we're talking." He taps into full cowling, and before the battle could start, All Might would cough out blood, be like, before saying, "Yeah, never mind, I used up my whole time limit today." With Izuku saying, "Not again, All Might," and All Might would simply be like, "Sorry, young Midoriya," before they just decide that they're just gonna do some normal, like, All Might's just gonna teach him a couple of moves, Izuku's gonna copy them, and yeah, the day would come to a natural conclusion. Eventually, we cut to the day where they end up all picking their UA Clash rep, and eventually Izuku would actually be the one picked at the top, with him gladly accepting the role. And this time around, what ends up happening is when the reporters come in and break into UA and all that commotion ends up happening, Izuku's actually able to use his quirk to jump up onto the air and then go to the exit sign saying, "Yo, we're pro heroes. How could you guys call you guys future heroes if you're gonna be scared of some news reporters? Just look outside. Some news reporters just got into UA. That's all it is. Stop worrying." Before everybody's like, oh yeah, you know, that's kind of true. And Ida would just be sitting there floating because Uraraka touched him, and he's now like, okay, so clearly my moment to shine was taken. And Izuku would hop back down for everybody returns to the cafeteria, and the class 1A would end up saying that, you know, Izuku did a pretty good job, before they all end up agreeing that choosing him as class rep, the best choice they could have made. With Ida acknowledging this as well, saying that Izuku is actually going to be a great class rep, apologizing to Izuku for the way that they met and saying that he hopes that they can become friends later on. With Izuku being like, "Oh yeah, totally dude, no hard feelings." Before all of them inevitably end up making it to class, where Aizawa would inform them about the USJ. Once he does this, he ends up passing a bunch of papers to everybody before telling them that they're going to be needing to have these signed by their parents. Once they see this, they're like, "Oh, I mean, sure thing. So when do we have to turn these in?" Aizawa would tell them that on Friday, because Monday, they're going to be going to the USJ, with all of them saying, "Alright, sounds good." All of them would go home, you know, they get their permission slips line. A couple of them would turn it in the first day, a couple of them the second day, a couple of them the last day. And yeah, we're now going to cut to the day of the actual USJ event. Now, this all starts off like a normal UA classroom day, so I'm not going to cover anything until they finally end up arriving on the bus and they travel outside. Izuku tells them all, come on, let's go, for all of them rush out of the bus without any order or anything, but they would end up meeting the hero 13. And she would begin explaining how quirks are dangerous, yada yada yada. You guys get the point. Eventually, about 5 minutes when they enter the USJ, they would end up spotting a strange warp gate portal in the middle of the USJ. And once Izuku sees this, he would think to himself if that's a real villain or it's just like training practice. He would turn to Aizawa, who would immediately jump down to the huge sum of villains that are already present and say, 13, protect the students! But she could do nothing to stop Kurogiri, as, you know, he proceeds to essentially warp gate all of the students away, almost all of them. And 13 would be left with nothing but a couple. Izuku would inevitably be one of the students that actually got warp gated away. And what ends up happening is, actually, no, retcon that. Izuku would not get teleported away because he has Ultra Instinct. I think Izuku would slightly be able to get out of the way and dodge the attack, leading to Tsuyu and Mineta being the only people on the boat. How are they going to get out of that situation? Don't ask me, I don't know. But we're just going to ignore it and say that they figure it out somehow because I just don't feel like covering that. I mean, Tsuyu and Mineta, they're background characters, but I also don't want them to die just because, you know, if they die, then UA goes under a lot of pressure and we know how that goes. But what ends up happening is essentially Ida ends up busting out of the place with the help of Sato and Kirishima breaking down the door. And from here, what ends up happening is 13 ends up using her quirk to try to cancel. Well, no, not try to cancel, but to try to defeat Kurogiri. Now, Kurogiri would do his absolute best, and he would inevitably end up, you know, kind of destroying this man. So, what ends up happening is essentially, Kurogiri, after finishing 13, notices that the kid ran away and he teleports to Shigaraki's side, informing him that they don't have a lot of time and that he hasn't even spotted All Might. Shigaraki would begin scratching at his neck as Deku looks down towards the direction of Aizawa, as he would be thinking that Aizawa is definitely getting overwhelmed. He has to go down there and help. He jumps down there and gets side to side with Aizawa as he activates full cowling and begins fighting against the villains alongside Aizawa, making it a lot easier for him and taking a bunch of the toll off of the villains that actually have quirks. Izuku's able to quickly outpace them using his quirk of Ultra Instinct that he uses in brief flashes, so his aura would turn on and off, similar to when Goku fought against Frieza and used the Kaioken technique. And so, what ends up happening is essentially Izuku ends up bodying a couple of villains, and Aizawa would actually have a brief smile on his face, thinking that this Izuku kid definitely has a lot of potential, and that he fights very similar to a certain somebody that he knows. All Might. Before suddenly, we hear Shigaraki say, "Nomu, kill that guy," before the Nomu would rush in at Aizawa and punch this man away, sending him flying and breaking his left arm, before Aizawa would be crashing onto the ground and spin out of control, completely unconscious for a couple of minutes. Now, Izuku would look to the direction of the giant Nomu that stands before him as he would roar at the direction of Izuku, and he would simply look towards it before saying, "All right, this is going to be a lot harder than I thought." He begins jumping in and out of all of the attacks of the Nomu and eventually ends up landing a blow on the Nomu, which Shigaraki would laugh out loud, saying, "The Nomu has shock absorption," with Izuku simply thinking to himself that that's not good, before he then gets almost punched and barely gets like nicked, and then he proceeds to dodge out of the way again and again for the next following minutes, until eventually Shigaraki's like, "I'm tired of this, Nomu, why can't you kill the brat?" Before eventually Izuku would actually end up dodging. As he's dodging a bunch of the Nomu's blows that he's just throwing in quick succession, a portal would appear behind Izuku, and it would be Shigaraki's 5 fingers that actually were about to touch Izuku. But he's able to bend his body mid-air, and Shigaraki actually ends up holding grasp of one of the Nomu's arms, causing it to begin pretty much decaying, until eventually Shigaraki would say, "No, Nomu, rip your arm off," and the Nomu would grab the part of its arm that still wasn't hit with the decay, as it would begin to pretty much rip it off, and it would grow an entirely new one. Izuku would then go on to continue dodging, as Shigaraki would begin scratching at his neck, being like, "Damn kid, he's not getting hit, and he's not hitting the Nomu back," getting extremely irritated by the progression of events right now, until eventually we hear All Might's theme music playing as he arrives and rips off his tie Superman style, before then saying, "Don't worry kids, I am here. And he then proceeds to jump down there and have that 1v1 solo against the Nomu, with Izuku saying that he tried his best, but the Nomu had shock absorption and regeneration and super strength, so it was a really hard battle for him, saying that he'll back him up, as Izuku and All Might would both end up fighting against the Nomu, and it would relieve a little bit of the stress off of, All Might, until eventually he sent him flying out of the USJ after going plus ultra, and Shigaraki would still inevitably end up running away with Kurogiri, still of course being shot up by the hero Snipe, and he would simply run away with the rest of the villains being taken into custody. What would end up happening following these events is essentially Izuku and All Might would both kind of being in agreement that could have gone pretty bad, and they would end up rushing towards the direction of Tsuyu and Mineta, who at this point were about to get ambushed by the villains, but the pro heroes were here, and they would handle them for them, leading to Tsuyu and Mineta being perfectly safe. That said, we end up having the cleanup scenario happen, and All Might would end up thinking that All For One must have been behind all of this, and All Might, you're damn right, but it wasn't necessarily All Might, more like Shigaraki. That said though, what ends up happening following this is they have a 1-week break off of school, which Izuku takes full advantage of and begins working on his physical body, raising his 1-for-all percentage to about 27%, seeing as it was only a week. So, with 27% full cowling being, the new thing for Izuku, he's getting a lot stronger as the days progress, and he ends up learning a couple of new moves during this time, such as Air Force, where he flicks his fingers and he shoots little beams of air at his opponents. He's about as strong as the Izuku that ended up fighting against Gentle Criminal, and that's pretty strong, I would say so myself. I'm not really sure how much percentage of 1-for-all Izuku had at that point, but I think like around 26%, right? Okay, I just looked it up and turns out he only used about 15% against Gentle Criminal. So I'm going to say that he ends up, he still has 27%, but that was just a little off. That said though, what ends up happening is essentially Izuku at this point is now preparing himself for the UA Sports Festival, because that's something that All Might definitely would brief Izuku in on with a text, because he wasn't able to actually see Izuku for that week, seeing as he had to do a bunch of hero work, seeing as he had a week to do so, and he also had to be in contact with the police about the events that went down in the USJ, also with the capturing of the Nomu and stuff like that. It wasn't a lot of time for All Might to actually end up having a little mentor and student moment with Izuku as much as he would have enjoyed it. That said, what ends up happening from here is essentially Izuku would go back to class, and the event where the class 1B, general studies, stuff like that end up coming to class 1A's classroom and checking out the competition would still happen. Bakugo still is arrogant and tells them all to get lost, and he would end up looking towards Izuku's direction as he gives him a little bit of a snarl and he just walks off. From here, the day would go on like you guys would expect, and the very next day, the USJ would be going down. Izuku would actually be the one to give the speech this time, and Midnight would call Izuku up instead of Bakugo to actually go up there and tell the world that he's gonna try his best. He would give some really inspiring speech, something that is something corny but also inspiring at the same time, and people would begin cheering for Izuku. Following this, a bunch of the Class 1B students would, instead of hating Izuku more or hating Class 1A, would think that maybe it's just that one kid that's really annoying and, has attitude problems. But Bakugo doesn't care. Nonetheless, the first event would end up being the race, and what ended up happening from here is essentially Izuku would just get into the starting line, as Todoroki, as soon as the whistle is blown, would stomp his foot before ice would cover everything. And Izuku would just jump up into the air as the ice, it ends up being there, and Deku would end up pretty much trying to maneuver through the ice, which was a little difficult, but he ended up doing it through simply using his Air Force and breaking all the ice and shooting a bunch of people out of the way of his direction as he simply runs through, and he ends up seeing 3 giant 0-pointer robots. Once he sees these, he activates Ultra Instinct and 27% full cowling as he begins running through these 0-pointers, dodging, simply running up the arms of the 0-pointers as another 0-pointer came in and punched that 0-pointer in the arm, blowing it off, as Izuku would simply jump onto each 0-pointer until they would pretty much end up defeating themselves, hitting each other with their massive blows and such. That said, Izuku would end up passing them by and would end up catching up to Todoroki really quickly, before he inevitably ends up passing Todoroki by, and Todoroki would be pretty angry at this because he didn't think that Izuku was that fast. But yeah, He ends up using more ice and becoming faster, and Bakugo would be closing in on their tails extremely fast. Deku would eventually get to the area where there's ropes that help you cross like these bridges to like new rocks, and Deku would use his full Cowling strength to simply jump across and leap from rock to rock, making it to the other point and eventually leading him to the landmine area, where he would actually see the first place area right in front of him. Eventually, however, Todoroki and Bakugo would notice that Izuku is just way too much ahead of them, and instead of trying to bicker with each other, they try to use their quirks and max them out as much as they can in order to catch up to Izuku. But Izuku would push full Cowling to 30% and end up crossing the finish line a couple of seconds before Bakugo and Todoroki got the chance to. That said, this would lead to Izuku getting the 10 million point headband, and thus a bunch of people not actually wanting to team up with Izuku. Seeing as the events are kind of playing out similar to what they were in canon, I see no change in Izuku's team. So Tokiyami, Uraraka, Mei Hatsume, and Izuku are still going to be the team. And when it comes to the event of this, I don't really see a lot of things changing as well. Izuku still has the same team, the other teams are still the same. The only change that's actually going to happen in this version is towards the end when Todoroki grabs the headband from Izuku. Izuku's actually able to use Air Force Blast at a bunch of the other people, and so he keeps Todoroki at bay, and he also ends up punching Todoroki, almost sending him flying off of his thing. Bakugo would end up blasting off of his thing trying to grab Izuku's headband, but at the end of the day, Izuku's team was able to actually hold on to the headband this time around and actually go into things as the first place people. So that ends up actually changing the battles a little bit, but not exactly for Izuku. So only the other battles change, and since I won't cover them, they don't matter. But essentially, Izuku's fight with Shinso would still happen. And the way that I see this all going down is essentially after the cavalry battle would be over, Todoroki would mark Izuku as a target. Bakugo would tell Izuku that he better be glad he won this one event because he's gonna win the next, and that he better meet him in the finals, before looking towards Todoroki, not even acknowledging him, and bumping Izuku on the way out. Izuku would be told good job by his teammates and told that he did great, as Mei Hatsume would ask Izuku if he enjoyed her babies. Izuku was like, yeah, I guess. And from here, the first match would be announced. Shinso versus Midoriya. Okay, how is this gonna go down? Let me think. At first, I originally thought that Shinso was gonna win, but then I remembered Ultra Instinct lets Izuku's body move on its own whenever it's in danger. So here's what happens. Izuku gets into the battle area. Ojiro still warns him, but Izuku, being the dummy he is, he still ends up answering Shinso. Shinso smirks, thinking to himself that, he all but won this battle. Plot twist, Izuku's Ultra Instinct kicks in and he rushes towards Shinso's direction, using full Cowling to simply blitz in and punch Shinso straight out of the stadium, sending him flying clean into the grass, as Shinso is shocked. He could have sworn he had Izuku under his mind control, but what good could that do when Izuku's body is able to move on its own? After Shinso gets hit onto the ground and he gets startled, his mind control breaks and Izuku notices what just happened, thinking to himself that could have gotten very bad if Izuku didn't have the quirk that he has. Before then, walking off and being informed of the next match, which is actually going to be Todoroki versus Izuku Midoriya. Before that match could start, All Might would look towards Izuku before he tells him that he wants him to let the world know that he is here. Izuku nods to him, and Todoroki, seeing All Might and Deku talk, would ask him if he's some sort of secret love child of All Might. For Izuku, instead of his initial reaction that he had in canon where he's like, no Todoroki, I'm not. Instead, what ends up happening is Izuku, after hearing this from Todoroki, would go into an abrupt laughter, and Bakugo would be hearing this all going down, thinking to himself that of course he isn't some secret love child. It's not even how his quirk works. Before Izuku just laughs at Todoroki, and Todoroki gives him a death stare, telling him not to act like he's a fool, with Izuku saying he's sorry, but that's the dumbest theory he's ever heard, before saying that he better be ready for the next part of, their battle. And Todoroki would walk off, looking to Bakugo, as he just looks at him and says, "You heard that, didn't you?" And Bakugo would smirk, saying, "Love child," before Todoroki goes off and says that he better hope that Izuku's able to defeat him, because if not, he's gonna freeze him in that battle. And so Bakugo would simply just be like, whatever. As from here, he walks away, and Deku is simply left there to think about what Todoroki just said, before saying he's glad he didn't exactly find the connection, but the idea was definitely there. That said, what ends up happening is essentially Izuku goes to the waiting room, and he ends up running into Endeavor just like you would in the original. Endeavor would end up asking Izuku to actually make Todoroki, his son, use his fire side, and Izuku would ask why he wants him to use his fire so bad. Why doesn't he just tell him that? With Endeavor saying that it's none of his business, and Izuku would look to him before saying, if it's none of my business, then I'm not gonna help you. Endeavor would growl at this, and Izuku would walk off just nonchalantly with his hands in his pockets as he walks towards the arena, and Shoto would look towards Izuku as he would say, you better get ready to get frozen solid, with Izuku saying, I doubt it. He would stretch, activate full cowling, and as soon as Todoroki would stomp on the ground and shoot a giant geyser at Izuku's direction, Izuku leaps out of the way, dodging the attack, and then says, too slow. Like for part 4.